The porcelain bird sat on the edge of the radiator, its left wing already glued twice. It was Saroon's only inheritance from a father who was now just a ghost in a fading photograph. Her mother, Martha, didn't see a bird. She saw a target. With a jagged laugh fueled by cheap gin, Martha swept her hand across the metal. The bird didn't just fall, it shattered against the grime-streaked linoleum. "Stop looking at it like it's going to fly you out of here," Martha hissed, the smell of stale cigarettes clinging to her breath. "You're a Shirelle debt, Saroon. You stay until I'm done with you." Saroon didn't cry. She simply knelt, her fingers bleeding as she pressed the sharp, white shards into her palm, realizing that in this house, even the statues were punished for dreaming of the sky. Saroon was 19, but she had lived a century in the shadows of that apartment. She had learned to measure time not in minutes, but in the specific, terrifying rhythms of her mother's decay. She knew the exact pitch of a bottle hitting a wooden table that meant a lecture was coming, and the heavy, dragging footsteps that signaled a night of bruising. The kitchen sink ran cold. Saroon stood before it, her hands submerged until they turned a translucent blue. She wasn't washing the chipped plates anymore. She was calculating. If she turned off the faucet now, the sudden silence would draw Martha's attention from the flickering television. If she kept it running, she was wasting resources. Survival was a mathematical equation where the answer was always a hidden bruise. She touched her collarbone, feeling the heat of the newest mark, a dark plum swelling that matched the shape of a heavy remote control. It throbbed in time with the flickering fluorescent light overhead. "Saroon, where's my tea?" The voice was a rusted blade. Saroon dried her hands on a rag that was more holes than fabric. "Coming, Mother." "Don't mother me with that tone. You think you're better than this place? You're lucky I haven't tossed you to the debt collectors yet." Saroon kept her face a mask of neutral stone. Experience had taught her that any flicker of emotion, hope, pain, even weariness, was a hook Martha would use to tear her open. She walked to the small table, setting down the mug. As she did, she glanced out the narrow, grime-coated window that overlooked the street. The black Bentley was there again. It had been appearing for 3 weeks. A sleek, predatory shadow parked near the corner, its engine a low, expensive hum that didn't belong in a neighborhood where the cars were mostly rusted skeletons on cinder blocks. It sat there, patient and dark, like an observer from another dimension. "What are you looking at?" Martha demanded, her eyes narrowing. "Nothing. The street is just quiet." Saroon lied. "Go to the store, get my cigarettes, and don't you dare think about taking the long way through the park." Saroon grabbed her thin denim jacket. It offered no protection against the biting November wind, but it covered her arms, and that was all that mattered. As she stepped onto the sidewalk, the cold air hit her like a physical blow. She welcomed it. The walk to the corner store was her only sanctuary, a 20-minute suspension of the constant vigilance required within those 4 walls. She walked with her head down, her shoulders hunched inward to make herself as small as possible. In this part of the city, being noticed meant being vulnerable. She felt the car before she saw it. As she passed the Bentley, the tinted window slid down just an inch. She didn't stop. Stopping was dangerous. Not her peripheral vision caught a glimpse of a hand resting on the steering wheel. It was a man's hand, steady and clean, with a heavy signet ring that caught the amber glow of the street lamp. She didn't look at his face. She couldn't. But she felt a gaze on her that wasn't like the leering stares of the local junkies. This gaze was heavy, analytical, and strangely still. Inside the store, the hum of the refrigerators provided a temporary drown-out for the noise in her head. Mr. Abbas, the owner, didn't look up from his paper. He knew the marks on her neck. He knew why she only came out at night. He, like everyone else on this block, had signed the unspoken contract of the poor. "I see nothing, so nothing can happen to me." Saroon paid for the cigarettes with crumpled bills and stepped back into the night. The Bentley had moved. It was now idling directly in front of her apartment building. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Was he a collector? Had Martha finally sold the last thing she owned? She climbed the stairs, her breath hitching. When she entered the apartment, the air was different. The television was off. The front door to the unit hadn't been locked. "Mother?" Martha was sitting on the sofa, but she wasn't yelling. She was staring at a plain white envelope on the coffee table. Her face, usually flushed with rage, was a sickly, pale gray. "Someone came," Martha whispered, her voice trembling with a fear Siroon had never seen. "A man in a suit. He didn't say a word. He just put this down and looked at the kitchen, like he could see right through the walls to where you were standing." Siroon looked at the envelope. On the front, written in elegant, sharp calligraphy, was a single name: Siroon. She picked it up. Inside was no letter, only a small, heavy piece of porcelain. It was a wing, white, delicate, and perfectly whole, the missing piece of her father's bird. Beneath it lay a card with a phone number and 3 words that made the world tilt on its axis: "I am waiting." Siroon looked at the window. Down below, the Bentley pulled away from the curb, leaving nothing but the scent of expensive leather and the terrifying realization that for the first time in her life, she had been truly seen. The porcelain wing sat on the bedside crate, a shard of impossible perfection in a room that smelled of damp wallpaper and old grief. Siroon spent the night staring at it. It wasn't just a gift. It was a message. Mailer Shurel, a name whispered in the city like a curse or a prayer, had found the one thing she thought was lost forever. He hadn't just watched her on the street. He had mapped the geography of her losses. The sun didn't rise the next morning so much as the sky simply turned the color of a wet sidewalk. "Where is it?" Martha's voice grated from the kitchen, sharp with the edge of a hangover. Siroon tucked the wing and the black card into her bra, the sharp edge of the porcelain pressing against her skin like a secret tooth. "Where is what, Mother?" "The money. That man. Men like that don't come to places like this to drop off bird parts. He bought something, or he's looking to." Martha stumbled into the doorway, her eyes bloodshot, her hair a matted nest. She looked at Siroon with a terrifying blend of greed and resentment. "You've been holding out. You're seeing him, aren't you? Using that pathetic little face to get a head start on leaving me." "I don't know him," Siroon said, her voice small but steady. "Liar." The slap was familiar, the sudden rush of heat, the ringing in her left ear, the metallic tang of blood in her mouth. But this time, something felt different. The weight of the porcelain wing against her heart felt like armor. Siroon didn't look down. She looked Martha directly in the eyes. "He didn't leave money. He left a choice." Martha's face contorted. It was the one thing she couldn't stand. Siroon having something she couldn't take. She lunged, her fingers clawing at Siroon's shirt, sensing the hidden bulge. "Give it to me. If it's from a Shurel, it belongs to the house." They scrambled, a frantic, ugly dance in the narrow hallway. Siroon's mistake was fighting back. She pushed Martha away, a surge of adrenaline overriding years of conditioned submission. Martha tripped, hitting the radiator with a dull thud. The silence that followed was deafening. Martha didn't scream. She laughed. A low, bubbling sound that made the hair on Siroon's neck stand up. "Oh, you're brave now. Because a monster in a Bentley looked at you? You think he wants to save you. Men like Mailer Shurel don't save things, Siroon. They collect them. And once they've broken the spirit, they throw the pieces away." Martha reached for the heavy glass lamp on the side table. Siroon didn't wait. She bolted. She flew down the 3 flights of stairs, her lungs burning in the frigid air. She didn't have her jacket. She didn't have her shoes. Only her socks hitting the cold pavement and the black card clutched in her shaking hand. She ran until her legs gave out, collapsing into an alleyway 3 blocks away, hidden behind a rusted dumpster. The cold was beginning to numb her toes, but the terror was white-hot. She pulled out the card. Her fingers trembled so violently she nearly dropped it. She pressed the numbers into her burner phone, each beep sounding like a heartbeat. It didn't ring. It simply connected. "Speak," a voice commanded. It wasn't the voice of a hero. It was deep, textured like gravel and silk, vibrating with a quiet, absolute authority. It was the sound of a man who owned the silence he occupied. "Hi," Saroon's voice cracked. "I'm at the corner of 5th and Miller, behind the grocery." "Why are you crying, Saroon?" "I touched her. I pushed her back. She's going to kill me this time." "Stay where you are," Mailer said. There was no comfort in his tone, only a chillingly calm sense of purpose. "Do not move from the shadows. If anyone but me approaches you, scream. Do you understand?" "Yes, I am 3 minutes away." The line went dead. Saroon curled into a ball, the brick wall leaching the heat from her body. The city hummed around her. Sirens in the distance, the hiss of bus brakes, the scurrying of rats. She felt like a bird that had finally fallen out of the nest, only to realize the ground was made of glass. Exactly 3 minutes later, the low rhythmic thrum of an engine filled the alley. Twin beams of LED light cut through the gloom, illuminating the swirling trash and the rising steam from the vents. The Bentley didn't stop at the entrance. It drove deep into the filth of the alley until it was inches from her. The door opened. Mailer Shurell stepped out. He was taller than he had seemed from the car window, wrapped in a coat that cost more than her mother's life. He didn't look disgusted by the trash or the smell. He looked only at her. He stepped toward her, his movements fluid and predatory. When he reached her, he knelt in the grime, heedless of his clothes. He didn't reach for her immediately. He waited, his gray eyes searching her face, settling on the blooming bruise on her cheek and the blood on her lip. "You made a mistake," he whispered, his voice a low vibration in the small space between them. Saroon flinched. "I know. I shouldn't have fought her." "No," Mailer corrected, his hand finally reaching out, his thumb brushing the blood from her chin with a tenderness that terrified her. "Your mistake was waiting this long to call me." He stood, extending a hand covered in a black leather glove. "If you take this hand, Saroon, the nightmare of your mother ends, but you must understand, I am not a quiet man. And once you are under my shadow, there is no going back to the light you knew." Saroon looked at the hand. Behind her lay the rotting apartment, the broken bird, and the woman who wanted to crush her. In front of her was a man who smelled of winter rain and power. She reached up and took it. As he pulled her to her feet, his grip was like iron wrapped in velvet. He didn't put her in the back seat. He opened the passenger door, placing her in the warmth of the leather interior. As he climbed into the driver's seat, he didn't look at the road. He looked at her bare, frozen feet. He reached into the back and pulled out a heavy cashmere blanket, draping it over her with a clinical efficiency. "Where are we going?" she whispered. Mailer shifted the car into gear. "To the only place in this city where you are allowed to breathe." He turned the steering wheel, and as they pulled out of the alley, Saroon saw her mother standing on the corner, screaming, her face a mask of impotent rage. Martha lunged toward the car, but Mailer didn't even tap the brakes. He drove past her as if she were nothing more than a ghost, his eyes fixed forward, his profile as cold and unyielding as a mountain. Saroon watched the apartment building disappear in the rearview mirror, but as the warmth of the car began to seep into her bones, she realized she was shaking harder than she had in the cold. She was safe, but she was also a prisoner of a different kind. "Mailer?" "Yes." "Why me?" He slowed the car at a red light and finally turned his head. The light from the dashboard turned his eyes into chips of flint. "Because I hate to see a masterpiece treated like scrap." The gates of the Surrell estate didn't creak. They hummed with a precision that felt like a warning. As the Bentley glided up the winding driveway, the city's grime was replaced by the suffocating scent of pine and ancient stone. The house was a monolith of glass and dark cedar, standing silent against the November sky. It was a place built by a man who valued his privacy more than his life. Mailer didn't call for staff. He carried her. He lifted her from the passenger seat, blanket and all, as if she weighed no more than the air she breathed. His heartbeat was a steady, rhythmic thrum against her shoulder, the only sound in the vast, echoing foyer. He set her down on a velvet chaise lounge in a room that smelled of beeswax and expensive tobacco. "Stay," he commanded. It wasn't an insult. It was a boundary. A woman appeared from the shadows. Mrs. Halloway. She was sharp-featured, dressed in charcoal gray, with eyes that didn't judge but didn't soften either. She carried a basin of warm water and a first aid kit. "Clean the glass from her feet," Mailer said, his voice back to that gravelly vibration. "Then dress her in something soft. I want the bruises documented, then treated." The next hour was a blur of sensory contrasts. The sting of antiseptic was followed by the soothing touch of silk. For the first time in 19 years, Sirun sat in a room where no one was yelling. The silence was so heavy it felt physical, like a weighted blanket. When she was finally alone, dressed in a silk robe that felt like liquid moonlight, Sirun stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror. She looked at her face, the yellow-purple bloom on her cheek, the split lip. Against the backdrop of the ivory-walled room, her injuries looked obscene. She looked like a smudge of coal on a white canvas. She reached into the pocket of the robe. She had moved the porcelain wing there. She held it up to the light, its jagged edge catching the glow of the chandelier. "It was a 1924 Meissen," a voice said from the doorway. Sirun jumped, her heart hammering. Mailer was leaning against the frame, his tie loosened, his sleeves rolled up. For the first time, she saw the ink on his forearms. Intricate, dark geometry that seemed to shift as he moved. "The bird," he clarified, nodding toward the shard. "Your father bought it at an auction 3 weeks before he died. He spent his last $500 on it. He wanted you to have something that couldn't be easily tarnished." Sirun's breath hitched. "How do you know that?" "I know everything that has been stolen from you, Sirun. I've spent years tracking the debts of men like your father, and the appetites of women like your mother." He walked toward her, stopping just outside her personal space. The air around him was cold, yet he radiated a terrifying intensity. "You asked me why you," he said. "You think I saw a masterpiece in you because of your face. You think this is about beauty." He reached out, his hand hovering near her cheek, but not touching it. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he unbuttoned the cuff of his own shirt and pushed the sleeve back further. Across the underside of his forearm was a silver line, a scar, jagged and deep, that shouldn't have been there on a man of his status. It was the mark of a blade, delivered with hate. "My father was a king in this city," Mailer said, his eyes turning to chips of frozen smoke. "And every night he reminded my mother and me that we were merely his subjects. I learned to measure my life in the same increments of pain you do. I watched her become scrap. I watched him break her until she didn't recognize her own name." The reveal hit Sirun harder than any of Martha's blows. This wasn't a billionaire's whim. This was a vendetta against a mirror image of his own past. "I didn't save her," Mailer whispered, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly soft register. "I was a boy. I hid in the cabinets and listened to the sound of her spirit shattering. By the time I was strong enough to kill him, there was nothing left of her to protect." He finally let his hand drop, his thumb grazing the porcelain wing she held. "I saw you at that window 3 weeks ago. I saw you calculating the silence before the water stopped running. I saw the way you tucked your soul into your pockets so she couldn't find it to burn it." He leaned in closer, his breath ghosting over her ear. "You are not scrap, Sirun. You are the second chance I never had. But you should know the truth of the man who took you. I didn't get this house by being kind. I got it by being the monster my father couldn't handle." He pulled back, his face a mask of iron once more. "The room is yours. The house is yours. But do not go to the north wing. And do not, under any circumstances, try to contact her. Martha is being managed." "Managed?" Saroon's voice was a ghost of a sound. Mailer reached the door, turning back one last time. The light from the hallway cast his shadow long across the floor, stretching until it touched her bare feet. She is alive, if that's what you're asking. But in my world, there are fates far more quiet than death. He closed the door, the lock clicking softly but firmly. Saroon stood in the center of the room, the silk robe cold against her skin. She was safe from the nightmare she knew. But as she looked at the silver scar on Mailer's arm in her mind's eye, she realized she had traded a chaotic cage for a gilded one, governed by a man who saw his own trauma reflected in her bruises. She walked to the window. Far below, the city lights twinkled like fallen stars. For the first time, she wasn't calculating the next blow. She was calculating the cost of being a masterpiece. The first week at the Sorrel estate was a study in sensory overload. For Saroon, safety was an alien language she had to learn syllable by syllable. In her mother's apartment, the air was always thick with the smell of scorched fat and despair. Here, it smelled of cold rain, expensive paper, and the faint, persistent scent of lavender that Mrs. Halloway used to dress the linens. The silence was the hardest part. It wasn't the empty silence of a vacant room. It was the heavy, watchful silence of a museum. Every footfall on the marble floors echoed like a heartbeat. Every meal was a quiet ritual of silver and porcelain. She was given everything: clothes that fit her perfectly, food that didn't taste of salt and shame. Yet she felt like a ghost haunting someone else's life. Mailer was a shadow that moved through the house at odd hours. She would see him in the early dawn, a dark silhouette on the terrace, or find him in the library at midnight, the glow of a single lamp illuminating the sharp, tired angles of his face. He never touched her again, but his presence was a constant pressure against her skin. "Why do you keep the north wing locked?" Saroon asked one afternoon. She was sitting in the solarium, the porcelain wing clutched in her hand. It had become a talisman, the only thing she truly owned. Mrs. Halloway stopped polishing the silver, her expression going blank. "Mr. Sorrel values order, Miss Saroon. Some rooms are meant for the past, and some are meant for the future. You would do well to stay in the present." But the present was a vacuum, and Saroon was a girl born of chaos. The escalation began on the 10th night. Mailer had returned late. Saroon was tucked into the corner of the library, hidden by the shadows of the high mahogany shelves. She heard the heavy thud of the front door and the low, urgent murmur of voices. She crept to the edge of the library door. Mailer was standing in the foyer, his back to her. Beside him stood a man she didn't recognize, lean, scarred, and radiating a restless, violent energy. "She's asking for more," the man whispered. "The woman, Martha. She says $10,000 isn't enough to buy her silence about the kidnapping." Mailer's shoulders didn't move, but the air around him seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Martha doesn't understand the geography of her new life. She thinks she is negotiating. Remind her that she is surviving. And if she goes to the press, even a hint of your name connected to a girl from the slums. The press doesn't print stories about ghosts," Mailer said, his voice a flat, terrifying line. "If she speaks, move her to the facility in the Highlands. No windows, no gin, just the silence she gave her daughter for 19 years. Saroon pulled back, her heart slamming against her ribs. The facility. The silence. She realized then that Mailer hadn't just rescued her. He had erased her mother. He wasn't just managing the debt. He was playing God with a soul that, however broken, was still the only mirror Saroon had ever known. An hour later, when the house had settled back into its suffocating quiet, curiosity, the old, dangerous itch of a prisoner, drove her toward the north wing. The lock on the double oak doors didn't click. It breathed open, as if the house itself wanted her to see. The north wing wasn't a dungeon. It was a replica. Saroon gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The room was a perfect, chilling recreation of a child's nursery. but everything was rendered in shades of gray and charcoal. There was a crib made of dark iron, a rocking horse that didn't move, and shelves filled with books that had no titles. But in the center of the room, on a pedestal of black marble, sat a glass case. Inside was a porcelain bird. It was the twin to hers, the Meissen 1924. But this one wasn't broken. It was perfect, its wings spread in a permanent frozen flight, and beneath it was a photograph. It was Mailer as a boy, sitting at a table with a woman who looked exactly like a softer, unbruised version of Cyrune. They were both staring at the bird with a look of desperate, fragile hope. "I told you not to come here." Cyrune spun around. Mailer was standing in the doorway. He looked different now. The polished billionaire was gone. His eyes were bloodshot, his shirt was unbuttoned at the throat, and the silver scar on his arm seemed to glow in the dim light of the nursery. "This was her room," Cyrune whispered, gesturing to the gray nursery. "Your mother." "It was her cage," Mailer corrected, walking into the room. He didn't look at the crib. He looked at the porcelain bird. "My father kept her here when he was managing her. He wanted her to be a masterpiece that only he could see. He wanted her to be perfect, even while he was breaking her bones." He stopped in front of Cyrune, his shadow swallowing her. "You think I'm different from him, don't you? You think because I gave you silk and silence, I'm the hero of your story." He reached out, his fingers brushing the porcelain wing she still held in her hand. He took it from her, his grip tight. "I didn't just buy your mother's silence, Cyrune. I bought her life. I own the apartment you lived in. I own the store where you bought her gin. I own the air you breathe in this house." He leaned in, his face inches from hers. The scent of winter rain was gone, replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of cold fury. "You aren't a guest, Cyrune. You are the only thing in this world I have left to protect, and I will burn this city to the ground before I let the world touch you again, even if that means I have to become the cage myself." He dropped the porcelain wing. It didn't shatter this time. It hit the thick gray carpet with a muffled thud, looking like a discarded bone. Mailer turned and walked out, the heavy oak doors swinging shut with a finality that sounded like a tomb. The lock clicked. Cyrune sank to the floor, the gray shadows of the north wing closing in around her. She was safe. She was fed. She was managed. And for the first time since she had stepped into the Bentley, she realized that the nightmare hadn't ended. It had simply changed its skin. The morning light in the north wing was a cold, clinical gray. Cyrune stayed on the floor long after the click of the lock, her fingers curled around the porcelain wing she had retrieved from the plush carpet. It was her only anchor. She realized that the silk and silence weren't gifts of healing. They were the padding of a cell designed by a man who didn't know how to love anything he didn't first possess. When Mrs. Halloway opened the door 3 hours later, she didn't offer a tray of tea or a kind word. She simply stood there, her face a mask of professional neutrality. "Mr. Sorrel is in the lower garden. He says it is time for the final calculation." Cyrune stood, her legs stiff, her heart a frantic bird in her chest. She followed the housekeeper down through the labyrinthine halls, past the library that now felt like a cage of dead men's thoughts, and out into the biting November air. The lower garden was a sunken stone courtyard hidden behind a high boxwood hedge. It wasn't meant for flowers. It was a place of shadows and hard edges. Mailer was standing by a stone bench, his back to her. He was dressed in a dark wool coat, his hands gloved in black leather. In front of him, kneeling on the cold flagstones, was a figure that made Cyrune's breath vanish. It was Martha. She looked smaller than Cyrune remembered. The fierce, gin-soaked giant who had ruled the 3-room apartment was gone. In her place was a woman with matted hair, dressed in a stained coat that wasn't hers, her face gray with a terror that went deeper than any bruise. 2 of Mailer's men stood behind her, their faces as expressionless as the stone walls. "Cyrune," Martha's voice was a pathetic rasp. She reached out a trembling hand, her eyes darting to Mailer with animalistic fear. "Siroon, tell him I'm your mother. Tell him he can't do this." Siroon stopped 10 feet away. The sight of her mother, the source of 19 years of nightmares, reduced to a shivering heap, should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like ash. Mailer turned. His eyes were devoid of the gray smoke they usually held. They were as flat and cold as the November sky. He walked toward Siroon, stopping just inches from her. He smelled of the cold and the metallic tang of something sharp. "She asked for $10,000 to tell the world I kidnapped you," Mailer said, his voice a low, vibrating hum. "She wanted to sell your trauma one last time to fund the bottle that killed your father. She doesn't see a daughter, Siroon. She sees a transaction." He reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy, dark object. A handgun. He didn't point it. He held it out to Siroon, the barrel resting on his palm, the grip facing her. "No," Siroon whispered, stepping back. "She broke your bird, Siroon," Mailer said, his voice dropping to that terrifyingly soft register. "She broke your spirit. She measured your life in blows. Now you get to measure hers." Martha let out a jagged sob-like sound. "Siroon, please, I'm sorry. I'll go. I'll never look for you again." Mailer ignored her, his gaze locked on Siroon. "This is why I brought you here. Not for the silk, not for the silence. I brought you here to give you back the power she stole. Once you pull this trigger, the nightmare ends forever. There will be no more debt, no more calculations, just the piece of a masterpiece that finally stood up." Siroon looked at the gun, then at Mailer's silver scar, and finally at Martha. She saw the cycle. Mailer's father had broken his mother, so Mailer had killed his father. Now, Mailer wanted Siroon to kill her mother so she could be whole like him. He wasn't saving her. He was recruiting her into his own darkness. Siroon took a step forward. Her hand trembled as she reached out, but she didn't take the gun. Instead, she opened her palm, revealing the porcelain wing, the jagged, broken shard of the only thing that had ever been truly hers. "You said you recognize the way I walk," Siroon said, her voice gaining a strength that made Mailer's eyes flicker. "You said you saw me calculating the silence, but you didn't see me, Mailer. You only saw a mirror of your own hate." She looked at Martha, who was watching her with a desperate, pathetic hope. "I spent 19 years waiting for the sound of the bottle opening so I could hide," Siroon said. "I spent 19 years wishing you were dead. But if I do this, if I let him make me like him, then I really am just a piece of scrap." Siroon looked Mailer in the eye. "I don't want your justice, and I don't want your cage." She turned to her mother. "You aren't a nightmare anymore, Martha. You're just a sad, broken woman who can't even afford her own gin." Siroon dropped the porcelain wing. It hit the stone flagstones with a sharp, final crack, shattering into 1,000 tiny white dust particles. "Let her go," Siroon commanded. It wasn't a plea. It was a declaration of autonomy. Mailer's grip on the gun tightened. The air in the courtyard seemed to vibrate with the pressure of his fury. His men shifted, looking for a signal. For a long, agonizing moment, the world hung on the edge of a blade. Mailer looked at the shattered porcelain at Siroon's feet. He looked at the girl who had refused the only gift he knew how to give: violence. "If I let her go," Mailer whispered, his voice like a winter wind, "she will go back to the slums. She will drink herself to death in a month. She will have nothing." "She already has nothing," Siroon said. "And for the first time, I have myself." Mailer slowly lowered the gun. He didn't look at Martha. He looked at Siroon with a mixture of confusion and a devastating newfound respect that felt more intimate than any touch. "Get her out of my sight," Mailer snapped to his men. As they dragged Martha away, she didn't look back at her daughter. She only looked at the ground. Siroon stood alone in the courtyard with the man who had rescued her and tried to own her. The silence returned, but it was different now. It wasn't the silence of a museum. It was the silence of a battlefield after the fire had gone out. "You're going to leave, aren't you?" Mailer asked, his voice sounding human for the first time, fragile and hollow. Sirun looked at the high boxwood hedges, then back at the glass monolith of the house. I can't stay in a masterpiece, Mailer. I need to find out if I can still fly with a broken wing. The glass monolith of the Surrell estate had never felt more like a tomb than it did in the hour following the courtyard. Sirun did not return to the silk-draped bed or the ivory-walled room. Instead, she went to the mudroom near the servants' entrance and found her old denim jacket. It was thin, smelled of the damp alleyway where she had collapsed, and the sleeves were still stained with the gray grime of the slums. But as she pulled it on over her shoulders, the weight of it felt honest. It didn't belong to a masterpiece. It belonged to a survivor. Mailer was waiting for her at the front doors. The dark wool coat was gone, replaced by a simple black shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal the silver scar. He looked older than he had that morning, the sharp edges of his face carved by a weariness that no amount of billionaire influence could mask. "The car's ready," he said. His voice was no longer a gravelly vibration of command. It was hollow, like a bell that had lost its chime. "I'm not taking the car, Mailer." He flinched, a small, almost imperceptible twitch of his jaw. "It is a long walk to the city limits. The temperature is dropping." "I've spent 19 years walking in the cold," Sirun replied softly. "I know the way." She stepped toward the door, but Mailer moved to block her path. He didn't reach for her, his hands remaining at his sides, but his shadow fell over her like a heavy velvet curtain. "I cannot simply let you walk back into that nightmare," he whispered. "The debts, the junkies, the memories, they are still there, Sirun. They are waiting for you." "They aren't a nightmare anymore," she said, looking up at him. "They're just life, and I'd rather have a hard life that I own than a perfect one that owns me." Mailer reached into his pocket. Sirun braced herself, expecting a check, a roll of bills, or perhaps another shard of porcelain. Instead, he pulled out a small, heavy folder and a single brass key. "I am a man of calculation, Sirun," he said, his eyes searching hers with a desperate intensity. "I know that if I give you money, you will see it as a chain. If I give you a job, you will see it as a cage. So I have done the only thing I have ever done well. I have cleared the path." He pressed the folder into her hands. Inside were documents, a birth certificate that didn't have Martha's name on it, a social security card, a clean credit history, and a high school equivalency diploma. "You are real now," Mailer said. "Legally, officially. The city sees you as a person, not a debt. And this," he held up the brass key, "is for a small studio apartment on the edge of the university district. The rent is paid for a year, not by Mailer Surrell, but by a trust fund in your father's name. I found the remnants of his life insurance that Martha never bothered to claim. It is yours, not mine." Sirun looked at the key. It was cold and solid in her palm. "Why?" "Because you were right," Mailer whispered, leaning down so his face was level with hers. "I didn't see you. I saw the boy I used to be. I wanted to win the war I lost 20 years ago. But you won a different war today. You chose mercy over justice. You chose yourself over a monster." He stepped back, opening the massive oak door. The wind caught the silk robe she had left on the chaise lounge in the foyer, making it dance like a ghost. "The North Wing is being dismantled tomorrow," Mailer said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, one that didn't reach his eyes but carried a heavy sincerity. "The nursery, the gray books, the perfect bird. They are going to the kiln. I am tired of living in a museum of my own grief." Sirun looked out at the long driveway. The sun was beginning to set, casting long golden fingers across the pine trees. She looked at the key, then at the man who had rescued her only to realize he needed saving himself. "Mailer?" "Yes." "Do you think you can fly with a scar?" He looked at the silver line on his arm, then back at her. "I think I might try to walk first." Sirun nodded. She stepped over the threshold, her old sneakers hitting the stone porch with a quiet, decisive thud. She didn't look back at the glass and cedar fortress. She walked down the driveway, the folder clutched against her chest like armor. She reached the iron gates just as the street lamps began to flicker to life. She turned the key in her hand, feeling the ridges and the weight of it. It wasn't a talisman of the past. It was a tool for the future. Behind her, the hum of the estate's security system faded, replaced by the distant, chaotic, beautiful roar of the city. For the first time in 19 years, Sirun wasn't calculating the silence. She was listening to the music of her own footsteps. As she reached the main road, a single black car pulled up beside her. It wasn't the Bentley. It was a simple, nondescript sedan. The window rolled down, and Mrs. Halloway looked out. "He said you wouldn't take the ride," the housekeeper said, her voice softer than Sirun had ever heard it. "But he also said I was to tell you that the locks on the studio have been changed. Only you have the key. Not even he knows where the spare is hidden." Sirun smiled, a real slow-blooming warmth that reached her eyes. "Thank you, Mrs. Halloway." "Good luck, Miss Sirun. Try not to be a masterpiece. It's too much work to keep the dust off." The car pulled away, leaving Sirun alone under the vast, darkening sky. She adjusted her jacket and began the long walk toward the lights of the city, a girl with a broken wing who had finally decided that the sky was worth the fall. 2 years later, the city did not look like a battlefield to Sirun. It looked like a map of possibilities. The studio apartment on the edge of the university district was small, but it was filled with things that had never been calculated. There were plants on the windowsill that thrived in the afternoon sun, a desk cluttered with textbooks on social psychology, and a small ceramic mug that didn't have a single chip in its rim. It was a home built not of silk and silence, but of lavender and ink. Sirun stood at the small counter, the scent of fresh coffee cutting through the crisp spring air. She was 21 now, and the hunched shoulders of the girl in the denim jacket had given way to a posture of quiet, unshakable grace. The bruises had long since faded, and while the memories remained, they no longer felt like anchors. They felt like a library, a collection of stories she had read and shelved, no longer the script she had to follow. There was a knock at the door. It wasn't the firm, rhythmic command of the past. It was hesitant, almost shy. Sirun opened the door. Mailer stood in the hallway. He wasn't wearing the black leather gloves or the heavy wool coat. He wore a simple linen shirt, the sleeves rolled up. The silver scar on his arm was still there, but it looked different in the hallway's warm light. Not like a brand of shame, but like a silver thread in a tapestry. "Sirun," he said. His voice was no longer a gravelly vibration of power. It was just a man's voice, steady and sincere. "Mailer, you're early." "I found I didn't want to calculate the traffic," he replied, a genuine, soft smile touching his lips. He didn't let himself into the apartment. He waited for her nod, a silent acknowledgement of the boundary she owned. When he stepped inside, he didn't look around like an inspector. He looked at her with a quiet, devastating pride. "You look whole," he whispered. "I am," she said. "And you? How is the foundation?" "The north wing is a garden now," he said, sitting at the small table. "We grow white roses and sage. Mrs. Halloway says the bees have returned. It turns out, when you stop trying to keep the world out, it actually wants to come in." Mailer reached into his pocket and placed a small box on the table. "I know you said no more gifts, but I didn't buy this. I made it." Sirun opened the box. Inside was a porcelain bird. It wasn't a 1924 Meissen. It was rougher, the glaze slightly uneven in places, the shape of the wings clearly molded by hands that were more used to gripping iron than clay. It was a bird in flight, but one wing was slightly higher than the other, tilted as if catching a difficult wind. "It's beautiful," Sirun whispered, her fingers tracing the cool, imperfect surface. "It's honest," Mailer corrected. "It's a bird that knows it can fall, but it's flying anyway. They sat in the quiet of the studio, the sounds of the university district, the laughter of students, the distant chime of a bike bell, filtering through the open window. There were no debts between them, no cages, no nightmares. I saw Martha, Mailer said quietly. She's at a facility upstate. She's sober, Sirun, not because I forced her, but because there was no one left to yell at. She asks about you. I didn't tell her where you were. That is your choice to make. Sirun looked at the porcelain bird on the table. Maybe one day, when I'm sure I won't flinch at the sound of a door closing. Mailer nodded. He stood to leave, pausing at the threshold. For a moment, the billionaire and the girl from the slums were gone, leaving only two people who had survived the same fire. Thank you, Sirun, he said. For what? For showing me that justice isn't a gun. It's a key. He walked down the hallway, his footsteps light and unhurried. Sirun watched him go, then returned to her window. She picked up the new porcelain bird and placed it on the sill, right next to her textbooks. Outside, the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the city in shades of gold and amber. A real bird, a simple gray sparrow, landed on the ledge, looked at the porcelain twin for a heartbeat, and then took off into the vast, open sky. Sirun watched it soar until it was just a speck against the light. She didn't look for a cage. She didn't look for a shadow. She simply breathed in the cool air and realized that for the first time in her life, the nightmare was over, and the morning was finally hers. This story of Sirun and Mailer reminds us that no matter how deep the shadows of our past may be, healing is always a possibility when we reclaim our own voice. If you found Sirun's journey from a living nightmare to her own quiet freedom moving, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs to believe in second chances. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss our next cinematic tale of redemption and hope. Thank you for being part of this story.